This video is brought to you by GiveWell. The Russian economy seems to be in an utter state at the moment. It faces acute labour shortages, high inflation, and is expected to slow down significantly next year. On top of all that, there's been fears of a looming real estate crisis, triggered by the sudden withdrawal of a generous mortgage subsidy programme, which now threatens to drive the Russian economy further into the ground. So in this video, we're going to look at why Russia is veering towards a real estate crisis, and why this is bad news for Russia's economy. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Let's start with some context. The acute phase of Russia's property crisis probably began in 2020, when the government introduced a preferential mortgage program to support the construction sector and save the real estate market from collapse during the height of Russia's COVID lockdown. This meant that, while the central bank was raising interest rates to combat rising inflation, the scheme kept mortgage rates at an artificially low 8%. By offering low monthly loan payments, the scheme became an absolute bargain for many Russians looking to purchase homes, and it quickly became immensely popular. So much so that last year, more than a quarter of all mortgage loans were linked to this scheme. Now, even though the programme was only meant to run for a year, it was continuously extended and ran until July 2024. This was for at least two reasons. Firstly, property emerged as a significant form of investment for both businesses and individuals following the invasion of Ukraine, as Russia faced numerous Western sanctions. In a volatile economy, many turned to real estate as a traditionally stable asset, especially because sanctions made it difficult to move cash abroad or invest in Russian stocks. Secondly, many property developers lobbied the Kremlin to extend the scheme as it significantly boosted sales for them. The Kremlin was happy to oblige, not least because it also padded out Russia's GDP stats and boosted the construction industry, which according to TASS saw a remarkable 24% growth between 2020 and 2023. In fact, in 2023, the amount of new housing constructed was the highest since 1990, and housing purchases that year represented 11% of the country's GDP. This construction boom, combined with a rise in defence spending, is one of the big reasons that Russia's GDP has continued to grow, despite Western sanctions. Anyways, keeping the scheme running for 4 years has cost the Kremlin something like 600 billion rubles. Obviously, the programme has become more expensive as the central bank hiked interest rates to deal with Russia's recent inflationary spike, and Russia's finance ministry estimated this January that the government would have to spend another 1 trillion rubles to continue the programme through to 2026. Now, up until recently, Moscow was actually in quite a comfortable position to afford this. This is because the Russian state really wasn't spending or borrowing very much money before the war, and it had a lot of so-called fiscal space with a low debt-to-GDP ratio and a lot of foreign exchange reserves. Additionally, when the war kicked off, Russia was reaping substantial profits from oil, thanks both to the relatively lax enforcement of Western energy sanctions and the general rise in energy prices post-Ukraine. So, with the state cashing in, the Kremlin found it relatively easy to continue the scheme. In recent months, however, the situation has changed dramatically. While Russia still has a bit of fiscal space, as evidenced by its relatively low debt-to-GDP ratio, the economy is overheating, largely as a result of unprecedented military spending, which currently makes up 8% of GDP. Now, we've explained this in a previous video, so do check that out. But what this essentially means is that the economy is growing at an unsustainable rate and has become unable to meet the demand it's creating. This has become evident in the country's high labour shortages and rapidly rising inflation. As such, the central bank advises Putin and his government that defence spending, which accounts for nearly a third of federal budget, needs to slow down. But with Putin accelerating his offensive in Ukraine, this likely won't happen soon, and expenditure is actually set to increase by almost 30% next year. So instead, the central bank has resorted to aggressive interest rate hikes. However, the effect of the interest rate hikes has been blundered by this scheme, which means that mortgage holders are protected from hikes past 8%. This is partly the reason why rate hikes have struggled to curb inflation, which is currently more than double the bank's 4% target. In July, the government finally heeded the central bank's advice and ended the programme for most eligible groups, aside from families with at least 2 children. This has resulted in significant upheaval in Russia's real estate market, and some speculation that the country is headed towards a full-blown property crisis. This is essentially because it looks like Russian property is dramatically overvalued. Mortgage lending has soared, and prices in Russia's big cities have jumped by over 170% in 3 years, according to The Economist. In this context, it looks like the withdrawal of the subsidy scheme could trigger a collapse in prices. With mortgage rates now linked to the central bank's benchmark rate, which currently stands at 21%, the average mortgage rate among Russia's largest banks has jumped from 8% to over 22%, with Sberbank, the country's largest mortgage lender, raising its rates to an astonishing 28%. Monthly payments have more than doubled compared to before, which will probably force quite a lot of homeowners to sell or downsize, and the spike in rates mean that no one can afford to buy at current prices, which is why mortgage approval halved after the scheme was withdrawn. Demand for new build apartments has also plummeted. In Moscow, sales of newly constructed properties fell by 48% between September 2023 and 2024, while other regions and cities have experienced even steeper declines. In Krasnoyarsk, sales dropped by an alarming 82%, and in Samara by 79% during the same period. As a result, real estate companies are facing serious challenges, and it appears increasingly likely that some of the country's largest developers, such as PIK and Samolet, may be on the brink of bankruptcy. While this hasn't triggered a collapse in property prices, which are infamously sticky because would-be homeowners are being pushed into the rental market, rents have soared. According to CIAN data, across Russia's regions, rents for one-bedroom apartments have risen by 10% to 61% just since August. Moscow and St. Petersburg have been particularly affected, with rents surging by 44% and 43% respectively. In Moscow, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment now stands at 68,200 rubles, or €617.40, which is the equivalent to the average national monthly salary. Now, at this point, you might be asking, what's wrong with this? After all, isn't it a good thing if the price of overvalued property comes down? Isn't that just a necessary correction? And well, that's half true. But dramatic corrections in property prices usually incur some serious short-term economic pain, which Russia just can't afford right now. To make matters worse, the obvious solution is fiscal stimulus, which is what China is trying at the moment. But this isn't really an option for the Kremlin, given how much it's already spending. Now, when you make a big purchase, say a car or a new mattress, how do you make sure that you're making the right choice? You could rely on all of the marketing copy in the product's ads, but many people find an independent resource that's rigorous and trustworthy. Today's sponsor, GiveWell, provides that independent resource for a different kind of purchase, a donation. For 17 years, GiveWell has been researching charitable organisations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities that they've found. That's things like bed nets to prevent malaria. It costs about $5 to provide one net. Nets can reduce the number of malaria infections. Enough nets and a large enough drop in infections can save a life in expectation. Together, over 125,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. I particularly like GiveWell as it ensures that your money is doing a lot to help those the most in need. Here at TLDR News, we're big believers in doing research to find out what's really going on, and that's exactly the approach that GiveWell takes to charities. If you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick YouTube and enter TLDR News at checkout. Make sure that they know that you heard about GiveWell from TLDR News to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.